This topic is going to be a little bit tough. It's going to be about transgender, but we're going to be looking at it from a rational perspective. But before we get to that, I'm going to post my information on my Patreon account. So for those who are actually interested, they can donate. It goes from $1 all the way up to $100 a month. It breaks down with it, and you can even donate more than 100. It helps me. I'm on disability currently. I have disability plus OCD with it, and you'll see I'll actually mention that a little bit later in this post and explain a couple things on that. To explain what that actually means, that I actually do care about mental health myself with it, and I do not care for people that actually try to basically use political outlets to essentially gain themselves on any type of other people for those reasons. Now, when we look at the actual case of let's get on to the actual point of the transgender argument. Now, I want to get out of the way with it. I'm not going with the idea of just hate speech, just trying to rag on them with it, saying, oh, they're not people or anything like that with it. That's completely irrelevant from the argument. I think that's pointless to actually just insult people just out of the reason to insult people. That's completely pointless. And when people do that, it's you don't even get to a valid argument or valid point in itself, regardless of if you're trying to of which type of point you're trying to get across. When you just start insulting people, it doesn't mean anything at all. Especially with a sensitive topic like this, we need to understand that. Now, getting that out of the way, we need to understand that we need to get feelings out of the way. This means we need to understand that we need to understand that there should be a difference considered between when someone actually is something biologically and when someone feels something biologically. And that's where we get to the idea of mental health. And that's the whole idea. What the transgender people are they actually feel like something else. And you can actually see this when we look at some of the other issues, such as we're seeing some of the people, like, say, they're transracial, even trans species. And frankly, I've seen issues of people think they're trans species of things like dogs and cats. That doesn't mean you're a dog or a cat. That's completely irrelevant, and that would mean that you're actually that means it's quite insane if we're going to be talking about if you're a dog, if we're saying that a human could be a dog or a cat in the same way. So that means the idea of feeling like something is irrelevant. What should be talking about is biologically. This is where, when we talk about in the cases of being gay, bi, or lesbian, those are biological conditions which are considered to be recessive to the actual productivity of the human race, would be considered as a negative point, but those are actually natural conditions. You can actually see them out in the wild. They do happen. Now, you do also see the cases of intersex or hermaphrodite, whatever you want to call it. You do see those cases as well out in the wild as well, with other animals. Those can be noted as well. Now with transgender, these basically, you'll see these in a couple of instances. Number one is in countries that basically have banned homosexuality, and what they do is they, in order to skirt around the law, they become a transgender because they know that basically it's doing this. This allows them to legally be homosexual in a country that bans them, so they can do it without being killed. You'll find this in throughout the Middle East. You'll find it in other Asian countries that actually have banned homosexuality, and this is where you'll find it. And when we see that some of these political groups that have tried to note this, it's really illegitimate because you're basically, this is merely a market solution for the banning of homosexuality, and they're looking for a way around it. Now when we look at and these are not actually what would be considered as actual transgenders. These are actually homosexuals that are homosexuals or lesbians that are actually trying to skirt their way around the law. And they're doing this because they know that if they didn't, and they acted as their own sex, that they could actually be killed for that. Such as if they did that in Saudi Arabia, in any of these other countries, they would be killed for such an action. And when we look at the other way, they can say it's a biological, it's a condition, and they can claim it's biological. I'm going to be a man. I'm a man in a woman's body, or a woman in a man's body, and they can do that. They can proclaim that and skirt around the law. They don't, and most of them, and basically none of them are getting the transitional surgeries, and there's a reason why. Because they're basically they want to still live that their current lifestyle, and that's the reason why. Now, when we look at the actual cases of the people like the people in Western nations, they have no reason to do this. So we need to look at them completely different. Now, originally, they would actually view these as cases of mental illness because it's because of what it directly is, and this was actually the proper way. But what ended up happening was you had political groups that were representing gay, lesbian, and bi people that were essentially trying to extort for money. They knew that if they could get this transgender group and claim it as another gender, that they could essentially get more money. So they basically essentially harassed the American Medical Association and the American Psychological Associations to basically proclaim it as an actual gender, remove their actual previous studies, that they could essentially gain more finance, because essentially you're moving up from 3 up to 4 onto your group. So essentially you're viewing just financially alone. You're viewing that you can essentially massively add on to your funding, but despite actually the amount, you're actually knowing that you're actually adding on people who are essentially mentally ill. You know you're taking advantage of that, which is completely illegitimate, which is just utterly insane and morally wrong. And that's what essentially what happened. And when we look at that, is what happened. That's why we have a different light on the whole situation. Is you have actually what really should be viewed as a mental illness. Now, me personally, I have chronic depression. I have obsessive compulsive disorder myself. I take medicine for both conditions. I've been treated for both conditions for quite some time. I believe it's been for about like a decade or so, and it's been about, I believe it's been about a decade even, and it's might be just a little bit over a decade, and uh, it aids people when they do that, and you're less likely to get these problems. But when you start proclaiming that it's a mental illness is a life choice, just like if you were to proclaim any type of physical injury as a life choice, it ends up being it ends up causing a lot of problems. Now, where's my evidence on this? With it, that would be that. Now, if you're considered gay, you don't have a high suicide rate. If you're considered straight, you don't have a high suicide rate. If you're lesbian, you don't have a high suicide rate. But if you're transgender, you have a 41% suicide rate next to the average person, which is 4.6%. We're talking nearly 10 times the actual percentage. And this is way out of whack. And we're talking USA Today can try to proclaim that it struggles on acceptance, but frankly, if you look on social media, you're going to see people that either A, don't care, or B, frankly, are basically people that are saying it's a mental health issue, and which is really that they do care, and they're looking from another perspective, or that they actually or that the fact is basically that they do care, and that they do care about it. So that they do care about these people with it, and it's that what we're talking about is that that these are basically is it's basically very, very rare that these things happen. For any type of bullying with it at all. And if when it comes down to it, because the fact is there's usually plenty of acceptance with it, because people think that there's been basically unanimous consent that any type of bullying is wrong. And people either A, don't care, or B, feel that what it called the mental health is something that we need to address. On the opposite side, or the other side, feels that, oh, it's an actual lifestyle. So when we're looking at it, is we have this whole thing of basically we're not seeing that basically that there would be much of a problem. So what we need to what it comes down to is, why is there such a high percentage? Well, there's such a high percentage because in many of these cases they're starting to in a lot of these cases they're starting to doubt their decisions, and they're starting to question themselves of those things, and especially where these suicides are coming from, or attempted suicides are a lot of times post-operation, and that's where these numbers usually tend to skyrocket because they're very, very distraught after those operations. And that's one of the things that's not brought up. Usually pre-operation they're not anywhere near as high as the post-operation, which shows that it's not about the actual idea, but rather of being transgender, being bullied, but rather the actual not addressing the actual inner problems themselves. And when we see, the fact is, when we see something linked like this with something such as very, very high suicide rates, we need to understand that it goes down to being an actual problem of something of mental health, not something of a life choice. We never saw this with, even at the worst time of non-acceptance, with gays, lesbians, or bisexuals at all. It was never anywhere close to these numbers. Even at the worst cases in any type of history time, nowhere near it. So what is the problem? The problem seriously is mental health, and it's being ignored. And this is why we need to view things not as feelings, not that you feel like a man, you feel like a woman, or something like this, but what is really going on. And a lot of times it tends to be stimulus from the media. It could be stimulus from the parents. Sometimes the parents, a lot of these parents, when they try to do these things, they're tending to push people in certain directions. And we're finding this with these non-binary parenting, and it's tending to push people in a certain direction away from what they would normally be addressing, and it's almost essentially child abuse. And what ends up happening is these things happen with it. It could be some other issue that's causing them to act in such a way. It could be, a lot of times it could be hysteria of what's popular, and they could act in such a way. It could be basically of the regional area being against homosexuality, being not as accepting homosexuality, them not willing to accept it, and them going toward this direction basically as a way of trying to hide it. And there's many other factors that could be the reason of what's actually going on, but in the end, we're talking, the factor is that they are essentially ignoring what's going on in the real world, and they need to understand that it needs to be that where they're actually addressing these problems. And when they start addressing these problems, they're going to see that it's going to eliminate all of these issues. And that's the whole situation to begin with. And when we start looking at some of the things like political, we're seeing these groups with it, that even when other types of people try to discuss with them some of these issues of such as GLAAD or some of the other LGBT groups, that when they try to discuss the actual issues surrounding this, is they shut people down the moment that people start to mention mental health and as an actual issue, because they're only concerned about money. And this is a sad fact. When you have a group that's only concerned about money and political prowess, they are essentially not, they don't care about the actual people. And this is an actual issue that needs to be brought apart. And we need to actually care about the actual individual. Stop going from these actual collectives that are actually tearing apart the actual problems and ignoring what's actually going on. And people, when we're talking about, oh, we need more, when these articles are talking about, oh, we need to look at mental health, well, they're not being honest with these stuff with it. If they're actually looking at mental health, you're basically saying that in one aspect they want more, they want to look at mental health, because they say they want to look at things that are affecting them from mental health with it. But the fact is in one aspect, but then they don't want to look at mental health from the other aspect, and it's completely completely disingenuous. And people need to understand that is you'll have certain groups that are on the mental health thing with it, but that have bought into the this new idea that they're an actual gender. But then you'll have other ones that have actually stuck to the original idea, which is actually smart, of actually viewing of actually basing their studies based on facts alone. And this is the way we need to do things, is we make our arguments based on facts and not feelings. And it might be harsh, might not be nice, but what we end up doing is we end up getting actual solutions that work. Because if we did things based on feelings, we would never get anywhere. And we would basically be basically spinning our wheels and getting to no solutions that would actually help people. Because the fact is these solutions would be horrible to begin with, and we would be stuck basically in the Stone Age. This is basically a solution we need to realize, is that this is basically a mental illness factor. You look at basically, and what a lot of people point to is, oh, but there was basically transgender basically in earlier time periods of the United States. Yes, that was basically due to women not having the option of owning land on their own. That's the reason why. So what they would do is they would take the role of a male. They were not having relations as a male. They were taking the role of a male so that they would actually have the ability to have land ownership. Solely as that. It had nothing to do with anything sexual whatsoever. This is not what it called. They were not transgender in the modern sense. They were only doing it in the same idea as what we're seeing out in the Islamic countries, but for a different reason. They were doing it for actually the business sense of land ownership. And that's why you are finding that. If you find every single case, you're going to find it for the reason of land ownership, because the only way to get land ownership was if you're a widow. Well, if they were actually single, they had no ability to get land, to own land. They needed to actually get a husband, and they would be considered the second owner of that land. And that's how it went. And the actual husband would have had to die to actually gain that land. This is when, such as if a wife were to marry and her parents were to give her land with it, essentially the husband would become the new owner of that land. This is how things would work. Well, in the case of if a female prospector were to discover land, she would not be the owner of that land. She could not legally be the owner of that land, and that's how these things were happening. So for her to actually become the owner of that land, in that case, she would have to basically fake herself as being a male, and this is what was happening. And this is what needs to be understood. And that's the idea of what needs to be understood in the whole case. And when we view the whole situation, is that the transgender issue is basically is there's no actual historic evidence that actually points down to it being anything but a mental health issue, and that needs to be understood. And anybody trying to take advantage of it from these political groups is just utterly insane. Now, when we get to these bathroom issues, those are completely irrational. I mean, those can be discussed in other different methods, and those need to be worked out for other situations. But when it comes down to the actual issue, we need to be talking about the individual. The individual, we need to be talking about what is the best care method and what is the best way to avoid them from killing themselves. As we talk about this, I'm talking about as me being completely pro-life. Now, to do this, we need to talk about a way for them to sustain their own ability for life, which means they need to value their life as is. Now, we do this by basically looking at what the actual numbers show. We need to get them, when it shows it, we need to get them away from thinking that they are transgender to them thinking of them as the rest of the general public, which would reduce the rate from to basically 11.2% of the value. Or if you want to view it the other way, is basically about 8.9 is basically, instead of being 8.9 times the size that they're currently at, and that's a major issue. Get them down to about 11% of the actual current value, which is a smart idea. So we need to look at this realistically, and while we're going to see, we'll see certain levels of bullying. You'll see that in any type of school, and it's going to happen always. But the fact is that's not what's contributing to this 41%. That would be closer to what's contributing to that 4.6%, because they can say there's homophobic taunts and other things like that, but that's going to happen to anything gay, lesbian, or bisexual in school. It's even going to happen to people that are not even mentioning their sexuality at all and are keeping that quiet. It can even happen to those people as well, people who are straight, who are basically not even mentioning it. So, and they're part of that 4.6 as well. So when we're talking about that, is what makes that 41% so high, and it's not from a lot of times people not accepting, because you can go to YouTube, you can find so many videos of people accepting transgender and all these other people, all those other things like that. So that's not the case. What's happening is that's not exactly the case out there. And we're not seeing discrimination out there, or victimization from the from what's happening. It's just because most people just don't care, and that's what needs to be understood. Most people just ignore you. Now, the only time something's going to happen is if you bring some type of lie forward. If you say you're a woman, like let's say you're a transgender woman, and if you just say you're a woman and you're pre-op, and they're expecting a biological woman, you might be getting with a little bit of a problem there, and that's because you essentially lied outright, and you might be having a problem there. But as long as you're upfront and honest, you're probably not going to have any problems, and that's the only time where you're going to have any that's the only time where issues are going to come up. And that's what needs to be understood, is that as long as you're being upfront and honest, basically and even and then when we start looking at this, even on USA Today with it, when they use the example, we can actually see that basically they grew up as a Southern Baptist in Louisiana. They said they never met any lesbian, gay, bisexual, or transgender person as a child, and they realized they had attraction to girls and began seeing girlfriend in the 8th grade. And if you look at if you look at what's actually happening, is is basically they end up getting there were insults and ostracism from that point. And obviously what's going to be the option with that is they're going to basically think that they're going to think that basically they need to become trans, and so that was a part of the of the stimulus of the situation. So they become a trans person becoming over to a male when they were actually born a female. And this is basically what we see, and it's basically no different than what goes on in the Middle East, and that's what needs to be understood. And we need to grasp that idea and realize that you'll find many cases like that. And you'll find cases where you're going to find that, and when it comes down to it, is you'll find this is what's happening, is that and what's happening with these percentages is basically is these percentages are higher because the fact is because it's based on a mental illness, and this is really what transgender is becoming, is something of essentially an out for people that are dealing with many other conditions of their stimulus that's happening within their society. It could be from just basically it being a little more conservative in an area that doesn't that might not tolerate within their family gay, lesbian, or bisexual relationships, because it might be a lot more of a conservative Christian area. Or it might be a case where it might be hysteria because of what's targeted on television and Hollywood. So they might be thinking that this is the way to become more popular. It might be from the way that they're being brought up with this non-binary child raising, or like this gender neutral child raising type of stuff, to where they're basically kind of confused within that area, and that's what's causing that. So and then what ends up causing is basically you're going to create more of a mental illness, because you're creating this whole situation where it's over 9 times the actual output of suicide rates. 9.6 times of what the average person is. The average person can that includes people that are gay, lesbian, and bisexual. And when we're talking about that, that's very, very disturbing. And if we actually care about individuals and aren't just looking to soak them for their money just so we can get basically political power, we would actually say that this needs to end, and we need to actually look at what's best in their interest. And the fact is when they say it shows right here with one of them saying the answer is to love your kid as is. Well, the fact is most people do, but the fact is and they say love and acceptance is the best medicine your kids can get. Well, a lot of times people do that, and that's not enough when it comes down to this, because a lot of times people do it regardless. Because the fact is we've a lot of times people out there have done this, and we've seen this, and we've seen these cases where they do that. And this is a case to where these people are actually doing this regardless of basically doing this regardless of this point. And we're talking that's we're talking basically is we have people that are actually it's a cause of the stimulus of what they're dealing with, and it's a case of the situation that's actually the problem. And if we want to actually stop suicide, we need to actually look at we need to actually view the transgender issue as an actual mental health issue. It's not an actual life choice. I mean, no more than jumping off a building is a life choice. Jumping off a building is not a gender. basically having yourself fired out of a cannon into a brick wall is not a gender. That's the whole thing with it. We need to make clear with it here. It's basically, this is a clear case of mental health issues that are actually being ignored, and we know that when we ignored mental health issues, we have suicide rates that are in horrifyingly high numbers, and we can declare that 41% of a suicide rate of 41% is horrifyingly high. And when we get that into the military, we know that number goes even higher, because the military has already horrifyingly high numbers from PTSD, which is another mental health issue. And that's another issue that's needs to get dealt with as well. And when we start to basically deal with, when we start to actually say that we need to deal with mental health issues, instead of saying we're going to ignore them because it's not politically convenient. I've seen people say in the military, oh, we need to we need to go to more war. We need to go to more war. People who are actually these neoconservatives or liberals, they advocate for more and more war, more and more war, more and more intervention. And the fact is we're just basically, all we're doing is committing people to death. And because if you're not killing them there, you're killing them back at home because of the suicide rates. And with this one, basically, is you're committing these people to death by ignoring the mental health issue. Stop basically ignoring it. There basically is no real legitimate level of transgender discrimination that's any higher than any other group out there. You go on social media, you're not going to find it, frankly. It just doesn't exist. The only thing people want is people want openness when you're actually discussing the issue with them. If you're going to date them with it, they want you to be upfront and honest. Don't lie about it. That's it. If you're a transgender female going from male to female, they want you to be open about it. If you're from female to male, they want you to be open about it. That's it. It doesn't matter if you're pre-op or post-op. They want you to be completely open about it, because the fact is there's a big difference, and there's other situations to consider down the road. And that's what people are going to be considering when dating. And that's not being hateful. That's just being bluntly honest. And that's not bullying. That's just asking legitimate questions. Now, if you're when these statements don't come out, then there could be some serious problems, because or if you lie about those statements, then essentially you are going to get whatever comes to you for lying. And that can be harsh problems. That's no different than a guy dressing up as a woman and claiming that he's a woman, and coming out there like a straight guy dressing up as a woman and claiming that he's a woman going on a date with a man. Well, you better expect some real dangerous, sharp problems with that, because the fact is he was expecting something completely different, and he's going to be pissed off. And because when you're dealing with emotions, emotions are going to be very, very high. And when emotions are heightened at that point with it, you're talking, anything can happen at that point. And This is why, and it should never be considered as bullying. It's not bullying. It's just basically a reactionary situation that's just happens for basically lying to the actual individuals. They want openness in their actual discussions. And when we see that, and there's been multiple cases that that's actually happened about, because essentially they feel that they've been betrayed when they actually get lied to. And if we're going to, but if we're going to go back to the whole problem, is we need to basically fix the issue. And we're not going to fix it by being sensitive to feelings. We're going to fix it by actually looking at the data. We see 41% suicide rate. We see that basically we've tried being sensitive to their feelings. Okay, that has not worked because the numbers have not changed. Okay. Now we need to basically look at where these things are coming from. They sure are not coming from people not being sensitive to their feelings. That's not what's causing that. They're not coming from any extra bullying than what anybody else is getting, or any type of other stimulus that anybody else is getting, because we see the actual numbers from other groups at being 4.6%, so it's a 9.6 times the actual amount. So what's causing this? This would mean that we're talking about an ignored mental health issue. And this is just what comes out to be the end. We need to address the actual mental health elephant in the room. And when it comes down to it, is mental health needs to be addressed at all cases. And this is why I always advocate for people addressing mental health, because you're always gonna go into something with it, and if you ignore it, you're gonna make it worse. It's basically the longer you wait, the more problems you're going to basically create. And you could take something that's very, very small and deal with it and solve it very, very quickly, or you can wait and basically start developing more and more problems. I mean, transgender should be considered no different than basically a situation like bipolar, or cases like schizophrenia, because what we're talking about is a serious delusion of what reality is. And I think schizophrenia would be a more apt situation, because they're essentially they're delusionary of what reality has become. Because the fact is they're viewing feelings of what doesn't exist, and they need to be brought back to reality. And I don't know if we can actually do it through the case of therapy or what, but we need to kind of explain them that these feelings are just as they are feelings. They aren't reality. And just like with people of schizophrenia, we're talking that these illusions that you're having are not real. And I know this is going to be hard for people to realize, but it's on the same level. And it doesn't matter what mental condition you have with it. You need to realize that those situations aren't really there, and they're not they're not helpful. just like with me with OCD, with it basically trying to keep everything in a certain order was not productive. And it was just basically essentially like spinning my tires, and it was making things a lot worse. And basically I just needed to learn to relax, because otherwise it was just going to create a lot of anger issues in the end, and that's the whole point. And when it comes down to it, is that's what I needed to learn, is just to learn how to actually relax a little bit more instead of focusing on this. And because I would basically go around checking on the house, making sure that certain things were in a certain order, making sure that it's triple checking, making sure all the burners in the oven were off before I could actually leave the house. And it would just be overboard, and it could take me up to like 10 minutes to actually leave the house, when more normal people could actually do it in about like maybe about 2 minutes in the actual reasonable time. And that's something that's very it can be very destructive to normal behavior, because you could be late to places, and then when you're actually working at different places, it can be very destructive. And you don't want to end up having destructive behavior that's personally destructive, just because you want to claim it as a lifestyle choice, or gender identity, or whatever you want to claim it as, or whatever reason you want to say to ignore it. It's not productive. It's just not. And when we start to look at the whole situation, is when we start to ignore it, you will see that you're not going to get any production out of ignoring your situation. And that's why we actually look to actually being productive. That's why we look to actually solving these issues. That's why we have a lot of these mental health professionals out there, being psychiatrists, psychologists out there, that we actually deal with. And that's why it's a industry that works in conjunction with your traditional physical health professionals. That it works in the same idea of, you wouldn't basically claim that compound fracture in your leg was a gender identity. No, because eventually it would basically get infected, and then that infection would probably lead to eventual death, because you can't live like that. And that's that should be considered the same idea. And ignoring it is completely irrational. And that's why I think we need to view this in such a way. And I know this is probably going to be hard for people to understand with it, but that's kind of what the transgender thing is. It is a mental illness. And there are still a lot of the psychiatrists and psychologists who actually feel this way, instead of the new application where it says it's not. And the only reason why there was a new application was because of political force from the groups like GLAAD. They were actually trying to force them over, and that was based on they wanted money from these groups that would donate based on this group with it. It wasn't about actually helping people. They'd never want to help people at all. They actually just want political influence. And they know they can get it by getting more money and by harassing these groups. So when we look at this, we can actually say that the ones that actually dug their feet in and say we're not going to move were actually the ones who were right, and who are not sticking in with these new type of adjustments to it, and are saying, well, these don't exist. We're basically sticking into the old original systems that say, well, because of these very high rates, we know that these are actual mental illness, and this needs to be discussed in such a manner. We can't ignore it. And you will find many a doctor out there who does this. You're not, you basically, I mean, if you can find a doctor out there who's willing to do that with it, you're actually going to be very, very well rewarded. You're not going to be well rewarded with one of these doctors who's basically going to pander to you and say, oh, it's just fine with it, it's society's fault, and no. You don't want that. You want someone who's going to be telling you the truth, that basically saying, this is not reality, and explain to you how biology works, and explain to you that it's basically is biologically the only things that happen biologically is bisexual, homosexual, lesbian, and straight. That's the only thing that can exist biologically. When it comes down to anything else, is you have to understand is that you have to understand that basically is that nothing else can exist. Because the fact is the way that animals react with it is you might have the intersex / hermaphrodite, whatever you want to call it, but that happen on an ultra rare situation from some type of horrible mutation. But when it comes down to it, the actual gender itself, or any other types of thing like that, you don't find transgender with animals. It just doesn't exist because they don't do that. Because it's not natural. It goes down on under the idea of mental health for a reason, and this is why we considered it for mental health for so many years, and why certain why some still considered under that because of it. And it's because of when we look at all the data points to all those points. Now, we might have some that actually want to break from that point, but when it comes down to it, is all the data points to being a mental health issue. And when we look at the data for when we look at the data for proving it as not being a mental health issue, we don't have much data to support it. Because even let's assume that there was bullying on this stuff, and let's assume it was was higher than the norm. Theoretically, it shouldn't be much more than double, maybe triple. So maybe we're talking, was that 13.8? It should be no higher than. That's even saying it's triple. It's 3 times the height of the average, and it's not. It's basically 9.6 times the average, and this shows that we're not talking about an actual situation of an actual case of bullying or any of these situations. We're talking about mental health here. Mental health is a completely different situation, because mental health means that there's an actual legitimate problem. And if we're talking about mental health, we're talking about something that needs to be addressed. And needs to be addressed clearly. Now, if you like this topic, I know it's a little bit tough, but like, subscribe, click the notification bell, share it all over in social media. public to your friends and publicly, and right below here you will see the Patreon. If you missed it in the chats, you can click on there and you'll see the different levels to be a patron at each one of those levels, and you'll see each one of them from $1 all the way up to $100 a month. You can donate at, and each whatever level you can donate at is greatly appreciated. And that's about it. Bye, everyone.